Talking about potentially, I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it, but yes, there was a large Arab element to the Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, but now it's Afghans and Pakistanis.
I think that's been a biggest failure. Then taking eyes off Afghanistan by going to Iraq and, you know, involving themselves into another war. When they totally lost sight of Afghanistan, and then coming back to Afghanistan, particularly in a time as our friend from London just mentioned, you know, in the last 3 to 4 years, there's been an upsurge. Now you have had 150,000 troops or 100,000 or at least 70 to 80,000 troops always available in Afghanistan for the last 4 to 5 years. Now, why is it that this force actually led a reversal of the events in Afghanistan? The difficulty in Afghanistan today is that I don't think events remain in control of any party there. Events are leading everyone else, and that's been the most difficult part. When United States says that we do not have as kind of control as firm control over Karzai or what he does in Afghanistan, unfortunately it's a very bad position also to be in after 10 years of war.
Right. Mr. Zarifi, there's one point that, you know, I read out of the documents that you had sent me, and I'm going to read this for the benefit of my viewers. In the 9 months leading up to December 2010, at least 74 schools in Afghanistan were destroyed or closed as a result of insurgent violence, including rocket attacks, bombings, arson and threats. Of these attacks, 26 were directed at girls' schools, 13 at boys' schools and 35 at mixed schools. This, of course, in comparison to the fact that under the Taliban there were no schools for girls at all. So yes, you can say that at least some schools did come up, but this resurgence in December 2010 of attacking schools, to me is a figure that kind of really devastated me. What did we gain in 9 years then?
Well, I think to be clear, that's exactly right. I think if you compare the human rights situation with 10 years ago, as I said, there's been modest progress. But if you compare it with 5 years ago, it certainly looks much more stagnant and even possibly moving back. Couple of points, though, to be fair, in the difference, the question you were asking about the difference between the U.S.-led force in Afghanistan and the Soviet force in Afghanistan, certainly in terms of the impact, the damage to the civilian population, the international forces have been far less brutal. There's just absolutely no doubt about that.
Sure.
And it's important to remember that at this point, the real threat to human in Afghanistan certainly are the omissions by the international community and the Karzai government, but also very clearly the commissions, the very clear systematic attacks on human rights by the insurgent groups, by the Afghanis, by Hekmatyar, by the Taliban. I mean, the attacks on schools, the attack on journalists, the attack on health clinics, they're doing this on purpose. This is not collateral damage. They're targeting the schools.
Right.
So the threat to the Afghan people from the insurgents is massive. And again, also to be fair, it's absolutely true that we need to criticize the international community, but that doesn't mean the West alone. Afghanistan's neighbors all have something to be blameworthy for. The Iranians, the Uzbeks, the Pakistanis, the Indians, the Russians are all meddling, and none of them are meddling for the best interests of the Afghan people. They're all meddling for their own national interests, just as the Americans are. And so, unfortunately, it's the Afghan people who are paying the price for all of this.
Right, you do make a fair point there. In fact, yes, the Afghan people are suffering, but of course, Mrs. Zarifi, I have to add that we in Pakistan feel that we are suffering as well. And so we kind of put ourselves into the same boat in many ways because of the blowback that we talked about earlier.
That's an unfair view. The Pakistani people, and I've spent quite a bit of time in the Northwest, and now we're drawing more and more into Baluchistan, are suffering because of the poor policies of their own government.
Okay.
So they're also victims, but they're victims of their own government's meddling in Afghanistan, unfortunately.
Okay, good point. We're going to talk about that, but we're going to take a short commercial break. When we return, the point raised by Mr. Zarifi that Pakistan's government's poor policies have led to the blowback in Pakistan and the suffering of the Pakistan people. I'll get the opinion of my two guests here in Islamabad about that, so please do stay with us. And welcome back to Witness. Before the break, Mr. Sam Zarifi of Amnesty International said that one of the points that he raised, of course, is the fact that the suffering of the Pakistani people has been part of the reason for that is Pakistan's own flawed policies. Dr. Riffat, would you agree with that?
Well, I think we all have made mistakes, and I think there's no denying, there's no gainsaying that fundamental reality. But having said so, I think what the 30 years of warfare in Afghanistan have done, that they have created a war economy where you have the crime thriving, where you have the small weapons thriving, where you have this whole culture of violence that has taken place. And because I think Pakistan has been not only the victim of the flawed policies of its own government, but Pakistan has also been the victim of its sheer geography with Afghanistan. I mean, the very fact that you have 2.5 million Afghan refugees still present on the Pakistani soil
for 30 years.
For 30 years, you know, so, I mean, it's really a telling statistics. Yeah. And so therefore, I would say this, that you know, it is in Pakistan's interest to bring this situation or bring this, you know, bleeding wound to a close. But I think Pakistan alone cannot do it.
Of course not.
Pakistan alone cannot do it. So I would say that yes, Pakistan must accept, you know, its share of the blame. But I think the situation in Afghanistan, particularly now the event that you mentioned, you know, this is the 6th or the 7th major cross-border attack that has come from Afghanistan into the settled areas of Pakistan.
Right.
So this is certainly not something which is of Pakistan's making.
Wait, I'm going to get distracted from my main point here, of course, but why is this happening? Why are the Afghan insurgents attacking positions in Pakistan? Do you think that they're trying to make room for themselves to escape? What's going on?
Well, I think, I mean, their motives vary because most of these people actually fled the Pakistani area and they have joined with the anti-Pakistan forces on the Afghanistan side of the border. But I think the greatest difficulty has been the lack of effective monitoring of the Afghan side of this border.
Yes.
And I think if the NATO would have sufficient forces and the will to interdict this activity, they can easily do this.
They can easily do this. This is a continuing problem. Mr. Chaudhry, your comments on that as well, that why are the insurgents pressing into Pakistan right now from Afghanistan? Because right now it's reverse pressure from the Americans saying that Pakistan is allowing the Haqqani network to have safe havens in Pakistan and then attack Afghanistan. And we are seeing the reversal of that. We're losing people in this. What's going on?
Unfortunately, you know, the territory that Pakistan is alleged to have lost to the terrorists, I think a similar loss of territory is happening on the Afghan side. Not only that, about 30 to 40% of Afghanistan stays under the control of the NATO ISAF, and it is sort of alleged and stated that 60 to 70% is outside the control of the ISAF and NATO, which means, implicitly under the control of the Taliban. I want to go back to the point of why there is a different perception when you look at things from, let's say, West, sitting in London or New York or Washington, in terms of what is happening in Pakistan, why Afghans are suffering and why the Pakistanis are suffering. Well, we have a bad government problem, undoubtedly, but that applies to the entire country. What is happening in frontier, Northwest as well as Balochistan, is that these people tend to suffer a lot more. Many more have been killed, many more have suffered, and very simply because Pakistan has been sucked into a war which was not of their own making. It was a war of the United States. United States chose to come into Afghanistan.
You know, I'm going to get a little controversial here, okay? But just a thought that comes to me. Pakistan has been sucked into this war. We willingly went along with it in 2001.
That's perfectly fine. We may not have had a choice in terms of a geopolitical option at that point of time. But in terms of a more sort of a national point of view, from a society's point of view, we were pushed to make a choice. Either you fight or you
either you're with us or you're against us.
Can I
just a minute, please.
Yeah, hang on. I'll come to you, Mr. Zarifi, on that.
We need to also look at the fact that if there was a problem, let's say in Mexico, how much of flexibility would Mexico have in terms of in terms of looking at a problem occurring at the United States-Mexico border? Very little, I would imagine. You know? Now, we do not realize that Afghanistan is not Afghanistan. Afghanistan is United States of America, the 53rd or the 51st or the 52nd state or whatever. And because you have United States there, it is a superpower. It is in the neighborhood. It sits as a neighbor. So therefore, and the war is being led by United States. Pakistan, unfortunately, is on the receiving end. Despite having said that, we're going to fight together, we coalition partners, this and that. But Pakistan must see what is happening what is being done by United States, and must suffer the consequences, whether you like it or not. And
we have to also make a difference between the Pakistan military and the Pakistan government.
So you got sucked in, one. Secondly, you're fighting a war which has been United States war, and for that matter, we've carried this emblem of fighting the war on behalf of the entire world. Thirdly, of course, there are failures within our own system, and I think those are the kind of problems which have been imposed on Pakistanis as well. Bigger issue. Are we any closer to resolving this? After 10 years, is Afghanistan any better? Is Pakistan any better? Unfortunately, not.
No.
So therefore, the lesson to be learned is bad strategy, bad war to get into, never a just war, wrong war to get into, and wrongly conducted, wrongly imposed, and therefore that is why you could have actually gotten hold of these whatever 400 to 500 Al-Qaeda members in different ways.
Yeah,
so many different ways.
It's a whole different story. Mr. Zarifi, you wanted to say something?
Well, again, there's a tendency, understandable, to try to blame everything on everyone else. One of your guests very appropriately pointed out that one of the major problems in Afghanistan is that the Pashtun community never really bought into the peace talks. I mean, that's room for discussing that, but it is important. But if we want to see why there are such problems in the northwest of Pakistan and in Baluchistan, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Fatah, in Baluchistan, you have to go back and look at the laws that are governing Fatah.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
The Frontier Crimes Regulation absolutely relegates the Pashtuns of Pakistan to a human rights-free zone. This is a law that doesn't exist anywhere else on the planet, where people officially have no human rights.
Right.
So if Pakistan really wants to show Afghans, if it really wants to show that it can improve things, let's start with its own population. Let's show the Pashtuns of Afghanistan what's possible when people are given adequate rights and are engaged with, and they're bought into. And that's the reason why we see these cross-border attacks, because these insurgents at this point aren't following the lead of their anyone who may have at some point created them. They're now insurgents. Everything we hear from even the old Taliban is that the new Taliban, the new insurgents, the new Afghanis are completely out of control. They have no idea what they're fighting for, but they're just fighting against whatever is in front of them. And that's the blowback.
That's the blowback. I think that's so important. And now I want to switch gears in this program, because one of the more important things is we know where we stand today. We know how much we've suffered, how much the Afghans are suffering. When I say we, I sort of do mean that inclusively. A throwaway remark by you, AVM Chaudhry, triggered a point in my mind. You said this war is not a just war. Yeah. And we talk about justice of war, and if you decide the war is just, and you talk about the prosecution of the war and justice in war. I think it's just ad bellum and just in bello would be the correct terms on that. I believe it's now an unjust war. It has been for a very long time. But what should be the strategy to get out of the injustices being perpetrated on the people? This is a question for all three of our panelists. Dr. Riffat, you first.
Yes. I think one of the things that you need to do is to go for an immediate ceasefire, not only by the insurgents, but also by the Americans, who are using the drone strikes as a weapon of choice to kill these people. I think if you can have this killing from both sides come to an end and have a ceasefire, that will create the necessary space for you to actually initiate the peace process.
Let me play devil's advocate. The Americans say that when you try to do that, it just gives them time to regroup.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. Okay. It doesn't.
You don't buy
because
that. Okay.
in the peace negotiations literature, we have this term what we call the costly signals. So what is it that the Americans would like to send as a costly signal to their potential Afghan adversaries that they are serious in engaging with them? And I think the costly signal would be a temporary suspension in the drone strikes, because this idea that you can continue to fight them, you can continue to kill them, at the same time you want to engage with them. I think that logic, I think has run out.
There's no logic.
I mean that has run out. Sort of whatever logic there was to it in the last 10 years. So I think this killing has to come to an end. There has to be an armed truce, and then after that, let us get back to the negotiating table. Because if you continue to use violence, then violence will only beget more violence, and that will only harden the existing position. So Afghanistan badly needs a break from this warfare that has gone on, sort of for the last 30 years.
Peace. First